who's a professor at USC. Vatsal has done a lot of really exciting work in kind of understanding the trade-offs between different constraints on algorithms, so things like memory, fairness, robustness, along with computation time. Today, he'll tell us about a kind of algorithmic lens on understanding what transformers do. I really like the title, so Vatsal, looking forward.
Thank you so much, Andre. And thank you all for coming. I'm Vatsal. And I'll talk about using algorithms to understand transformers and perhaps using transformers to understand algorithms. So I come from a theory background. I got interested in trying to understand transformers a year or two ago. One reason I really like theory is that it helps us understand the landscape of possibilities. I think this is very nicely captured in this artwork from the Simons program on the complexity of statistical inference. So like any good piece of art, there are lots of different ways to interpret it. How I like to think about it is that different axes here could correspond to different resources, say the running time or the memory or the number of samples for solving a problem. And these different resources could interact with each other in different ways. There could be trade-offs depicted by all of these different regions, like deep seas, deserts, or grasslands. And theory can help us give a bird's eye view of the landscape without getting too lost in the details. So maybe like a compass to help guide us through the landscape. And theory can also help us understand what algorithmic structures are needed to solve the problem in a certain way. So whether a particular region is inhabited by sea monsters or dragons. I really like this figure. So can we use this understanding of the landscape to help understand models such as transformers? We already saw some great examples of this in the workshop earlier, how we can use complexity theory to understand what transformers cannot do. And I'll talk about how we can use theory to also understand what transformers do to solve various algorithmic tasks. And I'll also talk about how transformers can themselves help uncover certain interesting algorithmic structures and maybe help us discover this landscape and explore it, in particular for the context of exploring and discovering data structures for certain problems. So start by talking about linear regression, and we'll examine how transformers do linear regression in context. This is joint work with Deching Fu, Tianqi Chen, and Robin Chia. If you were at Ekin's talk earlier, then you already have the right context for this, but let me explain what in-context learning is. So essentially, the model is given some examples, and it should figure out the underlying task, here English to French translation, from the context of these examples. And the main difference from something like fine-tuning is that there are no gradient updates. So the model's parameters do not change as you get these examples. Transformers are very good at this. How do they do this? So there were these nice papers which study this, which influence a lot of our work, Garg et al. And Ekin, Jacob, and others' work, which investigated this for the case of linear models, perhaps the right place to understand this. The setting here is very simple. You get a bunch of examples, xi, yi. All the xi's are in 2 dimensions here, and yi's are perfectly fit by a linear model. So you get these 3 examples here, then you get this new example x4, and you have to predict the label of this new example. So one way to do this, obviously, is that once you have enough examples, you do linear regression, you solve for W, and then you use that to make your prediction. Transformers are really good at this. So in D dimensions, they get very small error with exactly D examples. How do transformers do this? And this has been investigated in these recent interesting papers. And the prevailing hypothesis is that transformers do this by something like gradient descent. Let me explain that. Suppose we have these examples from before. That's our input sequence. The idea is that transformers implicitly do gradient descent across different layers on, say, the mean squared objective with respect to these particular examples. So we have the sequence. The first layer will do a gradient descent step. Each layer will do 1 or more steps. And then finally, you have some estimate of the answer, which you use to make your prediction.
What parameter are we putting this on?
So these are our examples, x1, x2, x3. And then you're minimizing the squared loss with respect to these examples to find your W. So gradient descent utilizes first-order information to solve this problem. So in this work, we'll argue that transformers actually utilize higher order, in particular second-order information, to solve the problem. And they seem to be utilizing the second-order information iteratively across different layers, doing something like an iterative second-order method. And they resemble some iterative second-order methods. And I'll describe more of this later. So before we do that, what is the broad philosophy here? Well, we'll use empirical investigations guided by some theory. So maybe something you can call applied theory. So, so how can we use transformers to understand? How can we understand how transformers solve a certain problem? So we have a particular transformer trained on some task. You could inspect the weights of the model and try to invert the mechanism, try to figure out what the model is doing. But this can be hard because the space of possible solutions can be very large and complex. These models are hugely overparameterized. Perhaps one solution is to use our understanding of this computational and information theoretic landscape to refine this search. What do I mean by that? So maybe we can rule out entire classes of algorithms that the model is not doing just based on the input and output behavior of the model. And maybe we can say something about what kind of information the model must use to solve the problem, also based on its input-output behavior. And I'll show instantiations of this later. But for this particular case of linear regression, we understand the landscape really well. So we know that there are information theoretic lower bounds on the rates achievable by any first-order method for solving the problem. And we also understand settings where the gap between first-order method and second-order methods is the largest. So can we use this understanding combined with empirical investigations to understand what transformers are doing? First, let me describe the setup and algorithms before I jump to the results. So here's the setting a little bit more formally. You have a data distribution. So for every sequence of an example xi, yi, you sample an underlying linear predictor W star from this isotropic Gaussian distribution. And you sample a data covariance sigma. Most of this talk, you can just think of sigma as being identity. And then for every example, we draw xi from the Gaussian distribution mean 0, and this covariance just identity for now, and yi is given by a linear model. So everything is perfectly fit by linear model. There's no noise. So there's lots of classical algorithms here. So if we have x be the matrix of data points so far, and y is the vector of labels, given some number of examples, then you can do ordinary least squares, use the pseudo inverse if the number of examples is less than dimension. You can also use a first order method such as gradient descent. You can do gradient descent on the sum of squares objective, and you get your gradient descent updates. You can also use second order methods. You can use an iterative second order method. So in this case, we'll talk about iterative Newton. The details of the algorithm are not particularly important. Here's the main idea. The main idea is that you try to find an approximation of the inverse x transpose x iteratively, basically using something like matrix Taylor series. So you start with your estimate of the inverse just being equal to x transpose x, and then you do some updates which follow from doing like Taylor series approximation of the inverse. And you use this estimate of the inverse of the covariance to find a linear predictor based on the OLS solution. So at the kth time step, you have some estimate of the inverse, and then you can use that to find your estimate of W, the predictor, at that time step. So we can talk about the convergence rates which these different algorithms get. So gradient descent, you can find an epsilon accurate solution in order log 1 over epsilon iterations. Solve for the well-conditioned case. Yeah, Matus?
Before,
yeah.
were the curves for this iterative Newton?
Yes, and I'll talk about those plots again. It is for this particular algorithm for some number of steps.
Maybe you can postpone to later, but I mean, how many other iterative Newtons or how many other variants of Newton methods did you try before you realized it was this one?
So we compared with this iterative Newton, and we also compared with some other second order algorithms. So we compared with things like BFGS, and you also see, and I haven't said what the result is, but you also see some similarity with respect to other second order algorithms. So it does seem like a lot of these second order algorithms for the problem are pretty similar in what they do. And what we really get is some similarity to a class of second order methods. And the similarity to a particular algorithm, I don't think is that important. It's really the class of algorithms which is important. That's a good question, though. So what does this class of algorithms do? It gets a much faster convergence rate. So you can find an epsilon accurate solution in order log 1 over epsilon steps, so exponentially faster than what you can do with gradient descent. And we'll use these convergence rates later. I'll remind you of it when we use them. But now let's talk about transformers. So we can train a transformer on this. So we just initialize a model at random. We train it on lots of instances of linear regression. The model is just trained to predict the next example xt plus 1 based on the examples x1 through xt. And this is like the GPT-2 architecture. It has 12 layers. And the final prediction for any example xt plus 1 is given by a linear predictor on top of the activation of the final layer. So what we ought to understand here is how these different layers of the model iteratively refine the estimate of the error, or what these different layers do more generally. So the prediction is obtained by training a linear model on the output layer, the final layer. But you can also train a linear model on, say, the first layer or any layer to see the estimate of any layer for this particular example. And by doing this, you get plots like this, which I showed before. So what is this here? The x-axis here is the number of in-context examples. The y-axis is the error on a log scale. These different green lines indicate the error of different transformer layers, where we do the thing that I said before, where you train a linear predictor on top of that layer. So what you see is that these brighter lines, which correspond to later layers, get smaller error. So the error iteratively goes down across different layers. And what we want to understand if this algorithm, this model, is behaving similar to some known algorithms. So we need to define a metric to do that. And we do this in a very simple way using similarity of errors. So if you have any data point x1, consider any two algorithms, say a transformer with a given number of layers, an iterative Newton with some number of steps. These two algorithms make their predictions. Then you can look at the residues of these two algorithms and look at that for your entire sequence of n examples. And then the similarity of the errors of these two algorithms on this particular sequence is just the cosine similarity between the residuals of these two algorithms. And then the overall similarity between the algorithms will just be the expected cosine similarity on average over lots of sequences drawn from the distribution. Okay, so let's go on to our results. So the first is just the plot that we saw before. And the main claim I want to make here is that transformers are improving across layers. So they're doing something iterative versus looking up the answer or jumping to the answer directly. So they improve across different layers. Now let's try to see if they are similar to some known algorithms. So consider this heat map. We'll start with the one here. So there's a lot happening here, but let me guide you through it. So the x-axis is the transformer layer index from 1 through 12. The y-axis is the number of iterative Newton steps. And this heat map, these colors denote the similarity in terms of this metric that I talked about before between some number of transformer layers and some number of Newton steps. And for iterative Newton, you see this nice diagonal-like trend. And we also have these yellow boxes here. These yellow boxes indicate the best matching Newton iteration for a corresponding transformer layer. So the fifth transformer layer here, even though you can't see it, is most similar to 8 steps of Newton. The main point is that we're seeing this linear relationship between the number of transformer layers and the number of iterative Newton steps. In contrast, now if you look at gradient descent, it seems to be much more like an exponential relationship. You need a lot more gradient descent steps to match these transformer layers. And now let's go back to our convergence rates, which I talked about before. Let's see if we can use that to make sense of this. So, yeah, Andre.
These are all in distribution plots?
Everything is in distribution.
How do they change? Like, how do they degrade if you start the program?
The farther you go away from it, things get worse and worse. The transformer isn't even that accurate if you go too far away from the distribution.
Right, but like, is the sum of the degradation roughly the same for the?
Oh, that's an interesting. We didn't compare the degradation across different algorithms. Yeah. Yeah, especially.
Like a ill conditioned problem or like a...
Everything is well conditioned. Yeah, I'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah. So let's see if we can use our convergence rates to help understand this. So Newton here, as I said before, it gets this log 1 over epsilon, these pretty fast rates. Gradient descent gets log 1 over epsilon rates. So if transformer layers behave similar to steps of Newton, then you expect an exponential relationship between transformer layers and gradient descent. It seems to be maybe exponential, but it's hard to really say. What we should really do is plot things on a log scale. And you do that here for gradient descent, but it now does seem to be very linear. It's just gradient descent steps plot on a log scale. So what this says is that across different layers, transformers seem to be behaving much more similarly to second order algorithms such as Newton than to gradient descent. You could ask if transformers could maybe be doing some other first order method. But now we can lean on our lower bounds and optimization theory, which tell us that you can't really improve on these significantly without using some second order information. And let's use theory a little bit more. So for example, can we find a setting? Yeah, Andre.
Is this also true distributionally though? I guess like
That's a good question. So we do have lower bounds for linear models too.
even distributionally for like a Gaussian prior.
They definitely have it for linear, like for linear systems. I don't know if they hold for Gaussian priors directly, but usually all of these lower bounds, like what we know, they all work for the Gaussian prior, and I'll talk about them a little bit. That's a good question. So what is a setting where this gap between first and second order methods is especially large? Like one such setting is ill-conditioned instances where gradient descent or any of its variants get a polynomial dependence on the condition number of the problem. So condition number is just a measure of how well behaved the problem is. For a linear problem, it's just the ratio of the largest to the smallest eigenvalue. Whereas second order methods can use this curvature information to get a much milder dependence on the conditioning. In fact, like we had a conjecture from USPICO related to Andre's question that in general, you cannot really improve on first order methods, in particular any linear memory method or even a subquadratic memory method, even for the Gaussian distribution distributionally, and avoid these polynomial dependencies in condition number. So this seems to be something inherent that you cannot get around unless you use second order information. And this suggests a hard distribution as well. So you can have your sigma, instead of being identity now, you can have it have d over 2 eigenvalues at say 100 and d over 2 eigenvalues at 1. So the condition number is about 100 here. And importantly, you'll choose the eigenbasis uniformly at random for every sequence. So you cannot really learn the distribution of eigenbases. There's a different eigenbasis for every sequence. And in this case, we don't expect the first order methods, so things which do not use second order information, to avoid dependencies in condition number. So what happens when we evaluate transformers on this? Essentially, they don't really change too much. So I won't go into all the details in the plot here, but transformer layers behave very similarly to what they did before. And iterative Newton also doesn't change so much as expected. In contrast, gradient descent, as you also expect, gets a lot worse. So even with 800 or so steps, it has a much larger error than what you get using transformers or iterative Newton. Yeah, question?
Do you see the same behavior if we have, say, noise in the labels?
If you have noise in the labels, then you still have like these. So these lower bounds are for the noiseless case, so they will also hold for the noise. We did try experiments with noise. We did try some of the experiments at least with some noise, and things didn't really change. Yeah. So you can now look at this the heat map that I was talking about before for the ill-conditioned case, and essentially things are very similar. Transformers are similar to Newton, so like Newton, they don't seem to be affected by conditioning, whereas like we still see this exponential relationship between transformers and gradient descent. So
why is the belief that one layer has to implement one step? This would be consistent if like I had an exponential growth of, I could compute like t steps and log t layers.
right.
So then I could expect an exponential and it could still be implementing gradient descent.
Right. So essentially, so what we're saying here is that to get these rates, you have to, like if you have some algorithm which matches these rates, then you have to use second order information, or you somehow have to have something where, like as you're saying, maybe like the fifth layer computes 200 steps, but the sixth layer computes 500 more steps, and the next layer computes 2,000 more steps. So somehow, like as long as you expect things to like not behave kind of similarly, like not have this exponential dependence, and even then, like things get like you don't even see that kind of similarity, because for these ill-conditioned instances, you just cannot get as small of an error using gradient descent. So you really have to like compute a lot of steps, like some point like prohibitively large, in order to match the second order methods on the problem. Oh, yeah, question.
Sorry, I missed, but did you say anything about that node can compute that iteration step of Newton method?
Can you see that once more? Sorry.
Did you say anything about the computability of it? The node can compute?
Oh, okay, good. Okay, that's what I was going to talk about next. So can they actually implement this iterative Newton? So we show some theory that they can do this. So it's just a representation result. So we show that you can implement Newton. So you can match predictions of k steps of Newton with basically k layers, some additive factors, and order d hidden units per layer. D is the dimensionality. So in correspondence with the kind of behavior that we're seeing empirically. And this uses a lot of ideas from previous work too. And this result was just for representation. There's been some very interesting work on analyzing the training dynamics as well. And this recent work of Vladimirov et al. Actually shows that you can do like a second order variant of GD where you use second order information and mimic iterative Newton by implicitly approximating the inverse, sort of like bridges the gap between like our results and what some of these previous papers observed. And there's also a nice paper by Jason Dimitris et al., which show that transformers can do this iterative Newton beyond regression too. Okay, so now I want to just talk a little bit about why transformers are able to utilize this second order information. So let's compare them with other architectures, say an LSTM. The details of the architecture are not important, but essentially the main point is that an LSTM processes things one by one. It's a recurrent architecture. And now we can do the same thing with an LSTM, see how different layers behave. And what we see is that transform LSTMs here, first, they don't seem to actually improve that much across different layers. And they seem to be much more similar to something like online gradient descent than something like Newton. So this pink line here is LSTM, and blue line is transformers. The orange line is online gradient descent. Seem to have similar behavior. And I think maybe more crucially, seems like OGD, LSTMs forget previous examples. What do I mean by that? So if you test the model on an example that it saw before in the sequence already, the model gets a much larger error if it saw the example a long time steps ago in the past versus seeing the example very recently, which is exactly what we expect from something like online gradient descent. In contrast, transformers get a uniformly small error on any example that they already saw before. I think this has something to do with like the memory that transformers have, the fact that they get to store this entire sequence and do whatever they want with it, versus recurrent architectures which process things one by one. And there's also like some theory work that suggests that maybe this memory determines the best rate that you can achieve. Maybe the gap between these architectures is an instance of this. So I'll move on to the second part now. Are there any questions before I do that? Great. So in the first part, we took a randomly initialized model and tried to understand how it did regression. Separately, in real-world instances, it's clear that pre-training plays an important role. And in this part, we'll try to examine this role of pre-training in the context of this very simple task of addition. And this is joint work with Yan Yizu and Deching and Robin from before. Setting is very simple. So we fine-tune a pre-trained model, GPT-2 here, on this simple addition task. This is no longer in context. We do consider some in context in the paper, but this is just usual fine-tuning, simple addition task, two numbers and their sum. And we consider each number to be its own token. And since the largest number, which is its own token for GPT-2, is about 100, all our numbers will be at most, the largest number is 500. So all our numbers will be at most 500. So we fine-tune on this task, and the model, as perhaps expected, it does very well. It gets around 100% test accuracy. So the main question to understand here, perhaps, is what is the model doing? Can we sort of figure out what is happening here? To do this, we do something similar to before, where we try to understand the model's predictions at different points in the architecture, something known as Logit Lens, where really the main idea is that there are lots of residual connections in a transformer, and all of these attention and MLP blocks, they all make additive contributions to what is known as the residual stream. And your final prediction is just a linear model, this prediction head, applied on the final layer's activation. And to understand now if what is happening at any particular stage in this architecture, you can apply the same prediction head, this just simple linear model, on top of, say, the output at the end of any layer to understand what is that layer's estimate of the answer. Or you could also apply it to the output of any modules, like an attention module, to see what is that module's estimate of the answer and what is its additive contribution to the final answer. Because of this residual stream, everything is just additive. So yeah.
Do you retrain the prediction head when you apply it to a different layer?
Question. We don't retrain it. So this is just the same prediction head applied at different points.
But couldn't the information still be in there, but under
at different bases? Yeah, like, so actually, in this very simple task, it seems like it's all in the same basis. In the previous task, for linear regression, we did retrain it, and there it seems like the model is doing something more complex, and like it is in a different basis. But here, you can just use the same prediction head, and you actually see that like model is sort of making predictions in the same basis. But yeah, I think it's because of this residual stream and because this is a simple task, but it's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah.
When you put a prediction head, you're just mean like kind of the softmax and the unembedding matrix, is that right? Or is there more to that?
Just the unembedding matrix, actually. I like even before the softmax. Yeah. Yeah.
Are the embeddings tied?
Sorry?
Are the embeddings tied to the prediction? Are they the same thing?
Are the embeddings tied? So we have the input embedding, and then we pass it through all of these layers, and we get these representations. They're all in the same, like the same dimension.
Is it the same matrix transposed?
It's the same. Yes, yes. So it's the same prediction. It's the same linear model used to make a prediction for at any of these stages.
He's asking, is the unembedding matrix this transpose of the embedding matrix?
No, not necessarily. Yeah. So now let's try to see what happens when we do this for this very simple addition task. So the first thing to note is that, as before, the model seems to be improving across layers. So the x-axis here is the layer index, y-axis is the accuracy. Yellow line is the accuracy for exact match, and it improves over time. The model does know how to compute the answer with an error of ±2 or ±10 earlier on, but it's iteratively refining the estimate instead of looking something up. Now, what happens to at individual MLP or attention layers? So let's consider this particular input, the sum of 15 and 93. Now let's look at this plot. The x-axis here is the layer index from about 30 to 50. The y-axis is in the token space. So I'm plotting this from about 70 to 140 here. The right answer is 108. So at any particular column here, we're just looking at the logits that we get by applying this prediction head on top of the output of this particular MLP layer at that layer. Now, as expected, we're seeing a lot of mass around the right answer, 108. You see all of this red here denotes the higher logit mass. You see a lot of mass here, which makes sense, I think. I think the more surprising thing is that we also see this periodic structure. I hope you can see it at the back. For example, if you look at this particular layer, the 33rd layer, seems to be a periodicity of about 2 in the logits. So what seems to be happening here is that you're computing addition modulo 2, whether the answer is even or odd. And this layer here seems to be like, there seems to be a periodicity of 10. So there's higher mass at 78, 88, 118, and so on, in addition to the right answer. And then if you look at the attention layer, you see even more periodicity. You don't even see this mass around the right answer. All you see are these periodic trends, more or less. Does this make sense? Because now you basically build on this to understand what is happening.
Why is the last layer so high on logits?
Why is the last one so high?
It's so dense. Is there any reason?
I'm not sure there's a reason why it has to be. Because this is all additive at the end. Like the final prediction will be the sum of all this. So there's no reason that the last layer has to do so much work. Maybe that arises from the optimization dynamics. So if you see all of this periodicity, the right thing to do is apply some Fourier transform. So that's what we'll do. So we'll apply a Fourier transform, say, on the logits of this particular layer. And as expected, because we saw this periodicity of 2, we see this spike at a time period of 2. This is just in Fourier space. We see this big spike. You can also apply it to some of these attention layers. For example, this one seems to have a spike at a period of 5 and 10 as well. And all of this is for this particular specific example. Now, we should really look at all examples to see if there's actually something interesting happening. So we average this over all examples. What does that mean? The x-axis here is still the layer index. The y-axis is now different Fourier components. So higher up, that's higher frequency, lower time period. And this is just on average over all examples. So basically, we take this plot from here and then average this over all examples in our data set, and then you get these plots. And these heat maps in more red values denote that this Fourier component is stronger at that particular MLP or attention module in that particular layer. So what we see here for MLPs is that we see this low frequency components here. And you also see all of this spikes at different frequencies, these higher frequencies of period 10, 5, 2, and so on. And if you look at attention, actually, you don't even see this low frequency mass. All you see are these higher frequency components. And the main point is that these logits seem to be pretty sparse in Fourier space. You see all of this sparsity. And you can call these Fourier features. These are basically sparse representations in Fourier space, where these low frequency components approximate the magnitude of the answer. What do I mean by that? Let's go back to this example of 15 and 93. So we have all of this mass here, around 108, the right answer. So you can think of this as a wave which has a very high time period, and it has a peak right around the right answer. So it approximates the magnitude of the answer. That's a wave with a very high period. But it doesn't have as much finer grained resolution. And these higher frequency components, they compute, say, whether the answer is even or odd. They do a classification, so compute the sum modulo p for some prime speed, seems like 2, 5, 10, and so on. And together, these low frequency and high frequency components can find a more accurate estimate of the answer. So I just want to go back to the fact that we're just training, fine-tuning a usual addition here. The task itself does not really have any periodicity, but somehow the model prefers to solve it using this Fourier representation. And given all of these frequency components, you can do some signal processing to see the impact of removing different frequency components, applying different filters. I won't go into this in too much detail, but what seems to be happening is that these MLP modules mainly compute low frequency terms. So as you saw in the plot, MLPs had a lot of low frequency components. Attention didn't really have that much low frequency terms. They mostly had high frequency terms. So, and I don't really understand why this is, why there is a split of this kind. Another question we should ask is, where do these Fourier features even arise from? This is just normal addition. There's no reason that you should use periodicity for this. At least the source that they come from seems to be pre-training. So we see these Fourier features in the token embeddings as well. So this is the Fourier transforms of the token embeddings. And you see the same spikes at 5, 10, and so on. And we also see this in different models. We try some other models in the paper too. We don't really see these kinds of spikes in Fourier space for models trained from scratch. So you can train a model, this GPT-2 model from scratch, at least till the point at which we trained it, we didn't really see this Fourier features arise. And also for the token embeddings as well. But you can train this model from scratch, but give it the token embeddings from the pre-trained model. And then what happens is that first speeds up training by quite a lot. The blue line is with the embeddings from the pre-trained model. And it also seems to give rise to some of these sparsity in the Fourier space, these Fourier features. Yeah.
You're training from scratch on the problem of addition?
Yeah. So there's also a lot of related work on like modular addition and how Fourier features arise there. Misha gave a nice talk on this earlier in the workshop and showed that these Fourier features seem to arise with recursive kernels. And in general, they seem to arise for lots of different architectures. And we saw here that they arise for this just usual addition, and somehow they seem to come from pre-training. I don't exactly know why. And maybe indicate that there's some universality to these Fourier features, somehow the right representation for different tasks. Something that could be good to understand, though I don't even know exactly how to formalize it. Let's say there seems to be something here. Yeah,
Sorry to miss the slide. Did you specify all the desiderata anywhere, like the positional encoding, causal masking, and all these things?
So yeah, so I didn't go into the details. So this is GPT-2. So we have causal masking. And it's again the GPT-2 embeddings, which are, I think, absolute embeddings.
And then for the theorems, you just did some like
Oh, we didn't have any theorems here. So this part doesn't have any theorem. Oh, for the previous part, so the previous part, like for the representation theorem, we actually, we have embeddings, which like we basically take these weights that implement the model. And for the representation part, we actually need full attention. We can't do it with causal attention.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
The reason I asked the question was, so you don't suspect that this affects any of these universality claims?
So for this part, like we don't have any theory to back this. But I don't think like it just seems to be something which seemed to arise across lots of different tasks. So something universal. So in the last 5-10 minutes or so, I'll go into the second part of the title, where we try to see if we can use transformers to understand the algorithmic landscape. So in particular, if you can use transformers to discover data structures for certain problems from scratch. This is ongoing work with Omar, Laurent, Shivam, and Greg. So you've all seen data structures. Here's how you should think about it for the purpose of this talk. So just think of nearest neighbor lookup in 1D really for all of this. So you have some input data, and there's a data processing component to the data structure, which outputs some nice representation of this data. In what sense is this representation nice? It is nice because it allows us to efficiently compute certain queries of this data. So suppose we have to compute the nearest neighbor to some query X. Then you have a query function which will do some lookups based on this particular query X. And based on the result of the lookup, that should find the nearest neighbor to X. if you're doing nearest neighbor search in 1D, then all you should do is just sort the data and then just do binary search in this query function. At least that's one thing you can do. And binary search will take log n queries, where n is the number of data points. And the two things that we'll care about here is the number of lookups, log n for binary search, and the space usage. What is the space of this representation? And actually for this talk, I'll just consider the case where the space of the representation is the same as the space of the input. So like we were doing with binary search, where you just sort everything. You don't really use any extra space. So data structures have been studied like for a century or something like that. And there's been this very recent line of interesting work to try to augment these data structures with machine learning. So you can augment these query functions with some ML advice. You can also augment these data processing functions with ML advice. But the classical data structures for the problem are still baked into the solutions. You're augmenting these solutions with some ML. But can we hope to actually learn everything end-to-end with machine learning with no algorithmic bias? Let me explain this for the case of nearest neighbor search. We have n data points x1 through xn. We have a data processing network, which will be a transformer, which will output a representation of this data. So we're not using any extra space. We're doing nearest neighbor search. This will be just a permutation of the original data. So this should output some useful permutation such that you can do queries efficiently on top of this. So we'll have query modules. So these will be MLPs. So we get a query. We want to find the nearest neighbor to this query. We'll do a once parse look at a particular position. And then we'll have another module for the second query, which will also get as input the response to the first query. And we do this about k times. And then we train everything end-to-end. So we sample a data set x1 through xn and a query point from some distribution. And we train on the squared loss of the model's prediction and the true answer. In some sense, like doing something end-to-end like this seems like the right thing to do, given all of the successes of end-to-end learning over the last decade or so. But on the other hand, it's also not clear if something like this can really take off. Like if this transformer here outputs some random garbled function of the input, then these MLPs can't really do much. And everything is very discrete and combinatorial. We have these permutations, these sparse lookups. So it seems harder to do something like this end-to-end. So what can we really learn here? You were surprised to find that you can actually learn quite a lot. So let's start with the simplest case, just uniform distribution in 1D. So our points are drawn uniformly from -1 to 1. You can do binary search here, sort the points, and then do your binary tree lookup. If you train this model end-to-end here, it first learns to sort with very small error. And it can do much better than binary search by exploiting this distributional information. So the x-axis is the number of lookups. Y-axis is the error of this end-to-end trained model in binary search. You can do much better for a small number of queries because you have an idea what the distribution is like. So this transformer learns to basically output a sorted version of the original array. And this query model can estimate what the quantiles of this uniform distribution are. So if it gets a particular query, say 0.8, then it knows roughly where it should lie in the sorted data. And then you can start your search from there and therefore be a little bit more efficient. It's basically something similar to interpolation search, which is better than a binary search for the uniform distribution. So what if you have harder distributions where these quantiles don't concentrate? So if you have this harder distribution, then you basically do very similar to binary search. And even the model seems very similar to binary search. So it first does a lookup in the middle, then it checks the 25th and the 75th quantile, then all of the ones in between and so on. So it's learning binary search end-to-end here. Let's go to higher dimensions. 2 dimensions, uniform distribution. In 1 dimension, you could just sort the original data. In 2 dimensions, it's actually not so clear what to do. If you just sort along the x-axis, that's not a very good idea because there could be 2 points close by, which are close in terms of their x-coordinate, but they're actually far away in terms of Euclidean distance. So they're not nearest neighbors. There's been lots of interesting data structure work on this. One classical solution is to use a KD tree. And in this case, if you evaluate KD trees and this end-to-end model, the end-to-end model can again do much better by using this distributional information. So it gets a much higher accuracy, especially at a smaller number of queries. And yeah, 100.
It's in distribution again, I presume.
It's in distribution.
Get out of distribution?
So if it's, we haven't tried too much out of distribution yet. I think if it's, like for example, if just the distribution of the query model, the queries change, then it can sort of adapt. But if it changes drastically, then I don't think things would really work directly.
Okay,
doesn't even back out the trivial algorithm.
I don't think so. At least if we do, and unless we do something on top of what we're doing right now. But we haven't tried OOD much yet.
Like in the algorithms with predictions that we're
Yes, so we are not trying to like have this, like not have this best of both worlds here. We're just trying to see if we can use the distribution and do something. And how does it do this? Well, you basically learn to index nearby points together. So we can interpret what's happening here. So on the left, we have a data set of points sampled uniformly. They're colored by their original index positions. And these colors are random because the points are random. Now, if you look at the colors, after you pass these points to the transformer, then you see that nearby points tend to have similar colors. So the model learns to do some indexing such that nearby things are closer together. And by exploiting the uniform distribution. And you can consider now a harder distribution in 2 dimension as well, where things don't concentrate. And now we match KD trees. And it also seems that we learn something very similar to a KD tree. So like, what does a KD tree do here? Roughly, you first sort along some axis, say the x-axis, and then you sort each half along the other axis, the y-axis, and then you keep doing this for some number of times. So this is an image of what the representation of a KD tree looks like. I won't get into too much detail here, but the colors denote the similarity between 2 pairs of indices in the output. And for KD trees, it looks something like this because of the way things are structured. You have these halves. But you can look at the same thing for the output of the transformer. It looks very similar. Like the first and second dimensions are swapped. Things are symmetric, so there's no reason to prefer to first split along the x-axis. But apart from that, it seems pretty similar. So it's like it's learning how to like do this KD tree end to end. This KD tree is it's a non-trivial data structure. You have to sort along multiple axes alternatively, find the median and things like that. But it's able to do that, which I found pretty surprising. You can go to even higher dimensions. So in the next last minute or two that I have, so you can consider, say, 30 dimensions. So now, in this case, we don't even understand theoretically what the optimal data structures are. We don't know what is optimal, even for the uniform distribution, actually. And KD trees are known to suffer from this curse of dimensionality. The number of lookups depends exponentially on the dimension. We don't know whether this is necessary or not. But a popular alternative, which we usually use in high dimensions, is something like locality-sensitive hashing, LSH. So consider the setting and compare with LSH, and the model seems to do pretty competitively compared to like the right LSH solution for this task. And again, it seems to learn how to do something like LSH in the sense that with LSH, you do a bunch of projections and use that to hash things together. So over here, this query model also considers this 2-dimensional subspace, which we find by doing PCA. And what it's doing here is that it's bucketing things in different regions of the subspace together and doing a lookup based on that. Now, everything so far was with the Euclidean metric, but the advantage of learning things end-to-end is that you can also consider any metric space, and the model can learn the underlying metric space. So basically, consider the same 1D experiment as before, but instead of giving numbers as input, you give images of these numbers. And the query is also an image of some other number. And the model is trained on cross-entropy loss of the prediction, and the model gets no access to the labeling of the image as a number. It has to just work with in this image space, and then find the nearest neighbor in this number space. And it can do that pretty well. It gets a pretty small error. It matches a binary search oracle. So this is an oracle which actually knows the labeling of the images as numbers and then just does binary search. So it performs pretty competitively as compared to this oracle. So just to summarize like the main claims here, seems that we can train models end-to-end to learn these data structures. We talked about binary search, KD trees, and LSH here. We also consider settings where the model learns to use extra space. And we can also consider settings beyond nearest neighbor search. So it seems like we can also learn some interesting data structures for frequency estimation in data streams, things like count sketch. Models seem to be pretty versatile. They can adapt to the data distribution. And in general, it seems like we can interpret and understand a lot of these models, and maybe helping provide some insights for data structure design. For example, can we use these models to understand trade-offs in theory in settings such as high-dimensional nearest neighbor search, where we don't quite know what the right bounds are? And maybe like explore and discover new data structures in practice or even in theory for different data structure problems. I think I'll stop here. I want to thank all my co-authors once more, and thank you all for all your attention. Happy to take any questions if there's time.
the last piece is super interesting. There's some related structures, but did you turn off the NLP component of the transformer there? You talked about in 1D, it's learns permutation.
Yes.
Part dimension on top of like turn off NLP for this, or is also doing execution work?
So we still have attention and the MLP. But since you asked, so in order to like make training more efficient here, we have to do a differentiable version of sorting. So there are these tricks that people have developed earlier, which we use, and using these, we can train the model to do the sorting. But it's still the normal, like this is this nano transformer, nano GPT architecture. It's the usual transformer architecture. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. On both parts, very interesting. I guess I wanted to go back to Serbi's point earlier about the second order versus first order result. And I kind of agree with her that, like, in principle, it should be possible to implement, like, if you have depth D and exponential in D number of gradient updates by doing a binary tree construction. So, like, I'm wondering if you could differentiate between this, where, like, you're doing more work per layer. Like, is there some way to test whether this could be what's explaining the trends versus the second order method?
Yeah. So I think the main difference, like the way I think about is that like this work will keep increasing exponentially. So if you're dealing with things like the ill condition distribution, you have to really implement a lot of steps, like thousands of steps across a single layer, where in the initial layers you're implementing like one step or two steps.
Like kappa and log kappa and log, poly kappa and log. So the log difference you won't figure out, right? Because even if you have one step, you're just saying that the exponential steps of that are possible. So how will you differentiate?
So you would need a lot more steps, right? Like you would need like say if you have this polynomial dependence and condition number, then you would need thousands more steps than what you need for the second order method. So like for example, one thing you can do is you can just see if the behavior changes. If you look at the ill condition instance versus the well conditioned instance, if you're using second order information, then your behavior wouldn't change too much because you can correct for the conditioning. And what we see is that like the behavior of transformers doesn't really change so much. So like at least like whatever you're doing, you're sort of adapting to the conditioning of the instance, the curvature of the instance, which is what second order methods do. So like the models basically seem to be invariant to the data distribution being much more poorly conditioned. Which you won't really get with the first order method. You would have to you would get worse and worse if you were as you make your instances more and more badly conditioned.
Okay, let's thank Vatsal one more time. Let's be back at maybe 5 past